discuss Guantanamo Bay and the fight for Cuban sovereignty is Carlos Iglesias in Havana. He's a Cuban journalist. We're also joined by Julia Thomas. She joins us from New York. She's a researcher with the Guantanamo Public Memory Project. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Carlos, now that relations between the United States and Cuba are improving, what do the Cuban people hope will happen to the base at Guantanamo Bay?
Well, I think many people in Cuba are hoping that this problem will be solved finally after so many years. You know, this is a matter of national pride for many Cubans because it's a territory of the island which is occupied by a foreign country. And national feelings have been encouraged a lot during these last 57 years.
But Carlos, we just heard from our correspondent that this is not a priority for Cubans. The priority is lifting the embargo. So where does it feature in what Cubans want?
Well, Cuba would like to have the territory returned, but the main point is the U.S. embargo or blockade, as it is said, in the U.S. or in Cuba. No matter, this problem of the Guantanamo naval base is also very important because it is something like recovering part of the homeland. I think the Chinese people can understand this very well because of the history of China. And this is a problem of history. As in 1901, when the US demanded these naval bases or naval stations at the time, Cuba was under the US military occupation and it was clearly imposed. Even the military governor, Mr. Leonard Wood, was aware of that.
Right. Julia, Carlos just touched on some of the history of how this got into United States hands. What are the details here? How did this part of Cuba end up under U.S. jurisdiction?
Yes, so the history of how the United States came to be occupying this territory goes back to the 19th century when Cuba was still colonized by Spain. Over the course of that, the 19th century and prior to that, the United States had developed close trade and other relationships with Cuba. And during their fight for independence, the United States began to support those efforts. And when the Spanish-American War, or the War of 1898, concluded with Spain relinquishing its control over Cuba, the United States had a sort of condition of helping them secure their independence, which included an agreement to this lease, which Carlos mentioned, which stipulated that the Guantanamo base would be controlled and under the complete jurisdiction of the United States indefinitely, but ultimately Cuban sovereignty. So it's a very confusing sort of legal binding agreement that is what has led to kind of where we are now, with it being a sort of what people call a legal black hole, in which neither U.S. nor Cuban law necessarily very explicitly applies. So it's very much sort of a relic of the imperial efforts of the United States at that time, and also its ongoing efforts since then.
Right, Carlos, as we hear, it's a very complex situation on how this part of Cuba ended up in United States hands. And, you know, the Cubans have been calling for some time now for this to be returned. In fact, Fidel Castro, shortly after he came to power, said that this leasing arrangement with the United States is not legal, that the Cubans were coerced into handing this part of Cuba to the United States. Does he have a point there?
Well, I think it's not legal because it was imposed. At the time the Guantanamo naval base was open, it was because of the Platt Amendment, which was something like an alternative. Do you accept the Platt Amendment, or you don't have an independent country? You won't have a constitution. And in that case, it's impossible to refuse It's like the Don Corleone's offer in the Godfather. You cannot refuse that kind of suggestion from a superpower. And the Cuban parliamentarians at the time had to accept 16-11, the demand by the U.S. military occupation forces.
Julia, when we talk about Guantanamo, I mean, the immediate picture that comes to mind is, of course, the prison over there. But this started out life as a naval station. How did it become a prison?
Right. So over the course of the 20th century, it was early in the 20th century primarily a naval station and also a coaling station that was operated with mainly naval and other U.S. military officers. That then, over the course of the century, during the Cold War, things sort of shifted. But relations with Cuba were deteriorating. So after September 11th, the U.S. government under George Bush was seeking a space where people who had been captured abroad and suspected of terrorism could be held and interrogated outside of both the public eye and the sort of legal scrutiny that U.S. soil would require. And that's how it ended up with Guantanamo.
Carlos, as we heard, the Cuban foreign minister on his visit to the United States mentioned Guantanamo Bay. He said that Cuba would like it returned. To some extent, it has become a key issue in normalizing relations between the United States and Cuba. But right now, is it even on the negotiating table? Are the two sides discussing the status of Guantanamo Bay?
Well, this is a permanent request by the Cuban government because it is a territory illegally occupied by a military power. So it has always been demanded by the Cuban government since 1959, the return. Even they are not collecting the annual checks for $4,084 for the lease. And I think it will be very difficult to renounce to this request to return the territory.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there for now. Carlos Iglesias, you stay with us. Julia Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to take a break right now. Coming up, should Guantanamo Bay be closed? The Obama administration thinks so and has been promising to close it for almost 8 years. We discuss the future of the prison. That's coming up. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.